The call hit my console at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the exact hour when the city's pulse usually slows to a crawl and the air in the dispatch center feels stagnant. When I opened the line, there was no frantic screaming, no gasping for air, and no sound of a struggle. Only a silence so thick it felt like it had its own physical weight pressing against my headset. I went through the standard script, my voice echoing in the empty room. 911, what is your emergency? No one spoke, but I could hear a faint electronic hum in the background that suggested the line was wide open and active. I checked the signal trace on my monitor. It was a rock-solid landline connection originating from a quiet, upscale suburb called Northridge. I asked the caller to tap the receiver once for police or twice for an ambulance if they were unable to speak freely. After a harrowing 10-second delay, it finally started. A slow, rhythmic tap, 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 hitting the phone's microphone with a hollow, metallic resonance. It wasn't the soft sound of a finger on plastic. It sounded like someone was striking the receiver with a piece of polished bone or a metal tool, measured and precise. I stayed on that line for exactly 4 minutes, my headset pressed so hard against my temple that the plastic began to throb against my temple. Beneath the steady tapping, there was a faint, wet dragging noise that set my nerves on edge. The unmistakable sound of something heavy and soft being pulled across a linoleum floor. It was a repetitive motion, a cycle of 3 taps followed by a long slide and drag that seemed to last for several seconds before the pattern reset. I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck as I realized I was listening to a ritual, not an accident. I traced the specific address to 442 Northridge Road, a 3-bedroom ranch house owned by Arthur Vance, a retired librarian with a spotless record and no history of mental health calls. But as the tapping continued into the 4th minute, I heard a sharp, stifled gasp, a sound of someone trying to scream through a mouth that had been sealed or obstructed. It was a high-pitched, desperate whistle of air that made my stomach churn with a sudden, intuitive dread. The call ended with a soft, mechanical click that sounded like a relay switch being flipped, leaving me in total darkness. Just before the line went dead, a voice whispered a single, unintelligible word that sounded like a dry leaf skittering across a concrete pavement. We ran the audio through a digital filter later that night, and the waveform didn't look like human speech. It looked like a jagged, sawtooth frequency. My supervisor tried to tell me it was just a technical glitch or a cross line from a nearby construction site, but I knew better. I dispatched 2 patrol units for a welfare check, explicitly telling them to approach the house with their lights and sirens off to maintain the silence. When the patrol units arrived 10 minutes later, the house at 442 Northridge Road was a picture-perfect image of suburban tranquility. The lawn was freshly mowed into perfect diagonal stripes, the shutters were a pristine navy blue, and a single amber porch light cast a warm, inviting glow over a welcome mat. Miller knocked on the heavy oak door, expecting an elderly man in a radboat to answer with an embarrassed apology for an accidental dial. Instead, the house remained unnervingly still, the windows reflecting the dark street like the eyes of a dead man. Miller moved to the side of the house, peeking through the front window into a dining room that looked like it belonged in a furniture catalog. He saw a dinner table set for 2 with fine china, but the plates were piled with untouched, rotting steak that was crawling with flies. A bottle of expensive red wine sat open in the center of the table, the liquid having turned to a thick black vinegar that stained the tablecloth. The house wasn't just empty, It was a carefully curated stage that had been frozen in the middle of a celebration that never happened. Miller and his partner, Davis, moved to the rear of the property and found the sliding glass door in the kitchen completely unlocked. They entered the home with their flashlights cutting through a layer of dust so thick it looked like a coating of gray velvet on every surface. The interior didn't smell like a lived-in home. It smelled of industrial-grade bleach and the sharp metallic tang of copper. As they moved deeper into the kitchen, Miller noticed a strange low-frequency vibration coming from under the floorboards that made the silver in the drawers rattle. The refrigerator was humming, but the rhythm was distinctly mechanical, a synchronized thumping pulse that perfectly matched the tapping I'd heard over the 911 line. They followed the vibration into the small laundry room at the back of the house, where they found a brand new, high-efficiency washing machine bolted directly to the floor. It was running on a heavy-duty cycle, but the lid was locked with an aftermarket steel latch, and the drum didn't seem to contain any water or clothes. The machine was acting as a vibratory motor, sending a rhythmic pulse through the entire structure of the house. Davis found a set of heavy-duty tools on the counter and began to pry the washing machine away from the wall, revealing a sheet of brushed steel hidden behind the drywall. When he touched the panel, it slid open on silent hydraulic hinges, exposing a reinforced concrete staircase that descended into a pitch-black void. These stairs weren't made of wood or stone. They were lined with several inches of thick, acoustic, soundproof foam that swallowed the sound of their boots entirely. As they stepped onto the first landing, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, and the air became heavy with the scent of recycled oxygen. At the bottom of the stairs, the officers found themselves in a basement that didn't exist on any city blueprints, a high-tech, soundproofed bunker excavated into the bedrock. The walls were painted a blinding sterile white and illuminated by recessed LED strips that cast no shadows, creating a sense of total disorientation. There were no rooms for living or storage. Instead, the space was a labyrinth of narrow corridors that looked more like a surgical wing or a high-security laboratory. The vibration from the laundry room above was amplified here, turning into a deep, bone-shaking thrum that felt like a heartbeat. Miller peered into the first room on the left and saw hundreds of antique metronomes, all set to the same tempo and ticking in perfect, haunting synchronization. The architect had designed the space to strip away a person's sense of time, replacing the natural world with a singular, artificial rhythm. The walls of the room were covered with digital displays showing a countdown that reset every 4 minutes, matching the duration of the call I'd received. It was a psychological pressure cooker, a space designed to break a human mind by forcing it to exist within a rigid, inescapable loop. In the center of the main hall, they found the source of the dragging noise that had haunted the background of the 911 call. A series of weighted pulleys and steel cables were attached to a motor, dragging a heavy leather-bound sack back and forth across a rough strip of sandpaper on the floor. The motor was programmed to move in a specific pattern: 3 pulls, a pause, and then a long, agonizing drag that produced a wet, friction-filled sound. It was an automated soundscape, a machine built to simulate the presence of someone or something being moved through the dark corridors of the bunker. The corridors led to a central observation room, equipped with a bank of monitors and a high-end audio recording suite that was currently capturing the silence of the house above. Miller found a ledger on the desk titled The Reset Phase, containing detailed notes on sensory deprivation and the frequency of compliance. The notes were written in a precise, clinical hand, detailing how a human subject could be re-rendered if their environment was reduced to a single, predictable pulse. It was clear that the 911 call hadn't been an accident. It was a calibrated broadcast, a way for the architect to monitor the signal from a distance. As they moved toward the final door at the end of the hall, the rhythmic tapping became deafening, echoing off the white walls with a violent intensity. The door was made of solid lead and lacked a handle, operated instead by a keypad that had been smashed from the outside. Miller used a pry bar to force the door open, expecting to find a monster or a madman waiting in the dark. Instead, they found a room filled with soft white light and a chair positioned in the exact center of the floor, facing a wall of mirrors. The tapping stopped the moment the door swung open, leaving them in a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise. In the final room, they found the caller, a woman in her mid-30s who had been reported missing from a nearby town 6 months prior. She was strapped into a chair that was bolted to a massive rotating gear system, her body held in a perfect, rigid symmetry. She wasn't physically injured in the traditional sense, but her mouth had been surgically sealed with a transparent, medical-grade adhesive that made her look like a porcelain doll. Her fingers were encased in heavy metal thimbles, which she had been using to strike a small steel plate mounted to the arm of the chair. She didn't react to the officer's presence, her eyes fixed on the mirrors in front of her as her fingers continued to move in a phantom rhythm. Even though the plate was no longer there, her hands mimicked the tapping motion with a terrifying mechanical precision that suggested her brain had been hardwired to the beat. She was a component in a larger machine, her identity erased and replaced by a functional requirement to maintain the pulse of the house. The architect had used the 911 call as a stress test, a way to see if she would break her rhythm when faced with the possibility of rescue. The forensic team later discovered that the chair was connected to a series of sensors that monitored her heart rate and brain activity, feeding the data into the metronomes in the other room. The house was essentially a giant biofeedback loop, with the victim's own biological functions providing the power for the auditory torture. If her heart rate spiked, the metronomes would speed up. If she grew tired, the dragging noise would become louder and more aggressive. She was trapped in a conversation with her own fear, a closed-circuit nightmare that had no exit and no end. Arthur Vance, the man who owned the house, was nowhere to be found, but his presence was felt in every corner of the soundproofed bunker. He had left behind a video recording intended for whoever found the basement, a calm and rational explanation of his work in the Northridge suburb. He claimed that the human mind was a chaotic and inefficient broadcast that needed to be tuned to a singular, universal frequency. The woman in the chair was his masterpiece, a human being who had finally achieved true silence by becoming a living part of a mechanical clock. As the paramedics worked to free her from the chair, the woman finally looked at Officer Miller, her eyes filled with a hollow, crystalline recognition. She didn't try to speak or struggle. She simply reached out and tapped her metal thimbles against his tactical vest. Tap, 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 the same rhythm from the call. She wasn't asking for help. She was checking the sync. It was the realization that she was no longer a person, but a functioning piece of Arthur Vance's architecture that caused Miller to drop his flashlight and walk out of the room, unable to look at her for another second. Arthur Vance was never apprehended, his trail vanishing at a remote trailhead in the Great Smoky Mountains, where his car was found abandoned and empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no notes, and no footprints leading away from the vehicle, just a single metronome sitting on the dashboard, ticking at 60 beats per minute. The FBI believes he may have undergone plastic surgery and assumed a new identity, possibly continuing his work in another quiet suburb under a different name. He remains one of the most sought-after fugitives in the country, a ghost who leaves behind only silence and gears. The woman we rescued, Sarah, was taken to a high-security psychiatric facility where she remains in a state of near-total catatonia. She hasn't spoken a single word since the night she was pulled from the Northridge basement, but she is far from quiet. At all hours of the day and night, she continues to tap her fingers against any available surface, her rhythm never wavering by even a fraction of a second. Doctors have tried every medication and therapy available, but they cannot break the sync that Vance installed in her mind. She is a clock that cannot be stopped. The house at 442 Northridge Road was eventually demolished by the city, the basement filled with concrete to prevent anyone from ever entering that labyrinth again. However, the neighbors still refuse to walk past the empty lot after dark, claiming that they can hear a faint, rhythmic humming from the ground. Some say it's just the sound of the city's old plumbing, but others believe that the frequency Vance created is a permanent part of the land. The lot remains unsold, a scarred patch of earth in an otherwise perfect neighborhood, a reminder that some silences are louder than screams. I left the dispatch center shortly after the Northridge audit was finalized, unable to sit in that dark room and listen to the static of the city anymore. Every time a phone rings in a public place, I feel a jolt of electricity down my spine, my mind immediately racing to the sound of those metal thimbles. I've realized that Arthur Vance didn't just build a basement, he built a virus made of sound, and I am one of the people who caught it. I spend my days in a quiet cabin in the woods, but even here, the wind in the trees sometimes falls into that 3-tap rhythm. I still have the original recording of that 4-minute 911 call saved on an encrypted drive, a digital relic of the night the world went silent. Sometimes, when the house is too quiet and I can't sleep, I play the final 10 seconds over and over again. I don't listen to the tapping or the dragging noise anymore. I listen to the very last sound before the line cut. It's the sound of a woman's heart beating in perfect time with the metronomes. It's the sound of a world that has been successfully reset. And it's the only thing that makes sense to me anymore.